Los Angeles International Airport was bustling with travelers. The endless hum of rolling suitcases blended with flight announcements echoing through the speakers. In the middle of the controlled chaos, Officer Thorne Calloway adjusted his sunglasses, gripping the leash of Axel, a highly trained German shepherd. At his side, Agents Sullivan, Sully, Graves, and Ambrose Keaton stood near the baggage carousel, eyes scanning the crowd for anything out of the ordinary. Axel had been sniffing dozens of suitcases without any reaction, until now. The dog froze in place, muscles tensed, ears perked. Then, a deep, guttural growl rumbled from his throat. His gaze locked onto a black medium-sized suitcase, freshly dropped onto the conveyor belt. Thorne felt an uneasy chill crawl down his spine. Axel was trained to sit calmly when detecting illicit substances, but this time, he was behaving erratically. Passengers nearby noticed the dog's sudden aggression and instinctively stepped away. Some whispered among themselves, while others pulled out their phones to record. Sully shot Ambrose a concerned glance before speaking into his radio. "We need a baggage inspection team at Carousel 4. K9 alert, dogs reacting strongly." His voice carried an edge of urgency. Minutes later, a specialized unit arrived, carefully removing the suitcase from the conveyor and placing it on a security table. A portable X-ray scanner was brought over, and as the image flickered onto the screen, the room fell silent. Nestled within layers of fabric, tiny bone fragments appeared. This wasn't drugs. This wasn't explosives. It was something far more sinister. The team exchanged grim looks. With gloved hands, one of the officers cautiously unzipped the suitcase. The moment the bag was cracked open, an overwhelming putrid stench filled the air. It was the unmistakable smell of decay, thick and suffocating. Even Axel hesitated, his body tensing as if instinctively warning them to stop. Thorne leaned forward, peering inside. His breath caught in his throat. Amongst stained cloth and scattered debris, something small and unmistakably human lay curled in the shadows of the suitcase. Sully inhaled sharply. Ambrose clenched his jaw. Thorne knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning of something much, much worse. Thorne Calloway clenched his jaw as the weight of the situation pressed down on him. The stench of rot clung to the air, thick and nauseating. Around him, the baggage claim area was eerily quiet, passengers frozen in place, their curiosity now laced with unease. The suitcase sat open before them, its grim contents partially obscured by filthy, blood-stained cloth. The sight was enough to make even the most hardened officers tense up. Sullivan, Sully, Graves exhaled sharply, running a hand down his face. "Jesus Christ," he muttered under his breath. Ambrose Keaton didn't speak. His eyes, sharp and calculating, were locked onto the decomposing remains crammed inside the suitcase. A withered, contorted limb peeked out from beneath the fabric, the skin grayish and stretched unnaturally over bone. It was small, too small. A child. The realization settled like ice in Thorne's veins. He had seen death before, in all its gruesome forms, but this was something else entirely. Axel let out a low, uneasy whine, shifting back slightly as if disturbed by whatever scent lingered inside. The dog had never reacted this way, not even when detecting the most dangerous contraband. Thorne instinctively tightened his grip on the leash, though it did nothing to quiet the pounding in his chest. "We need forensics here. Now," Ambrose said, his voice a carefully controlled monotone. He was always the calm one, but even he couldn't hide the edge in his tone. Sully had already reached for his radio. "Dispatch, this is Agent Graves at LAX. We have a..." He hesitated, as if searching for the right words, before finally saying, "Human remains in an unclaimed suitcase. Send CSU and homicide ASAP." The response was immediate. "Copy that, Agent Graves. Units are en route." Thorne tore his gaze from the suitcase and looked around. Somewhere in this airport, the person who had checked in this bag was either watching or had slipped away unnoticed. That thought sent a surge of adrenaline through his system. His eyes swept across the sea of faces, some horrified, others filming on their phones, and some simply confused. "We need to lock down this area," he said firmly. "Whoever brought this here might still be in the building." Ambrose nodded in agreement and turned to a nearby security officer. "Get the surveillance footage from baggage check-in. I want to see who the hell checked this bag." Minutes passed, but they felt like hours. The crowd was being ushered away, the flashing red and blue lights of arriving law enforcement reflecting off the airport's polished floors. A forensic technician approached the suitcase, snapping on latex gloves. He carefully pulled back the layers of soiled fabric, revealing more of the remains beneath. Thorne forced himself to keep watching, to focus on the details, but the closer he looked, the worse it got. There was something wrapped around the child's wrist. A bracelet, tarnished but still intact, with a name barely visible beneath the grime. Thorne squinted, his breath hitching as he read the engraving. It was a name he recognized. And in that moment, he realized, this case was about to get personal. Thorne Calloway felt his stomach twist as he stared at the name engraved on the tarnished bracelet. Eleanor Finch. The letters, though partially obscured by grime and decay, were unmistakable. His mind reeled. That name had been plastered across news headlines 6 months ago. A 6-year-old girl who had vanished without a trace from her backyard in Santa Monica. Her disappearance had sparked a statewide manhunt, but the case had gone cold, leaving only grieving parents and unanswered questions. And now, her remains had surfaced in the belly of a suitcase at LAX. Sully. Graves ran a hand through his short-cropped hair, his usually laid-back demeanor now gone. "No way," he muttered, crouching closer to get a better look. "Are you telling me this kid's been missing for half a year, and now she's just here?" His voice was low, incredulous. Thorne remained silent, his fingers clenching into fists. Who would do this? And why dump her body in a suitcase at one of the busiest airports in the country? Nothing about this made sense. Axel let out another uneasy whine, his ears twitching. The air around them felt suffocating, as if the weight of the discovery had pressed down on everything. Ambrose Keaton, always the most composed of the team, turned to the forensic technician. "Bag the evidence and get it to the lab. We need a full autopsy, cause of death, time of death, everything." His tone was clipped, controlled, but the tightness in his jaw gave him away. This wasn't just another case. This was something far worse. A crackle from Sully's radio interrupted the thick silence. "Graves, we have security footage from baggage check-in. The suitcase was dropped off 2 hours ago. You're going to want to see this." Thorne snapped his head up, adrenaline surging through his veins. They had a lead. Whoever had left that bag hadn't covered their tracks as well as they thought. "Where?" he asked. "Control room," came the reply. Without hesitation, Thorne turned to his team. "Let's move." The hallway leading to the security office was a blur. As they stepped into the dimly lit room, a grainy black and white video was already paused on the screen. A lone figure stood near the baggage drop-off, their face obscured by the low camera angle. They were dressed in dark clothing, a hood pulled low over their head. But something was off. The way they stood, the hesitation in their movements, it wasn't the behavior of a hardened criminal. It was almost like they were afraid. Sully exhaled sharply, leaning in closer. "Zoom in. Play it." The footage resumed. The figure adjusted their grip on the suitcase, looking around nervously before stepping away, disappearing into the crowd. But just before they turned, the hood slipped back slightly, revealing a glimpse of their face. Ambrose inhaled sharply. "No," he muttered, his expression darkening. Thorne felt his pulse hammer in his skull. Because he knew that face. And if he was right, then this case was about to take a very dangerous turn. Thorne Calloway's breath caught in his throat as he stared at the grainy security footage. The brief glimpse of the figure's face was enough to send a chill down his spine. The wide, fearful eyes, the sharp jawline, the slightly disheveled hair. It was someone he recognized. But that was impossible. His mind raced through old case files, half-forgotten reports, and faded mugshots. And then, the realization hit him like a freight train. Asher Langley. A name he hadn't seen in years. Sullivan, Sully. Graves muttered a curse under his breath. Tell me I'm not seeing what I think I'm seeing. Ambrose Keaton didn't answer, his gaze locked on the monitor. Thorne's pulse pounded against his temples. Asher Langley was supposed to be dead. 2 years ago, he had been declared missing and presumed deceased after an arson attack that had wiped out his entire family. No remains had ever been recovered, only ash and debris. It had been one of the strangest, most frustrating cases Thorne had ever worked on, one that had never sat right with him. Thorne leaned closer, his voice low. Enhance the footage. The security officer at the console tapped a few keys, zooming in on the brief glimpse of Asher's face. The resolution wasn't perfect, but there was no mistaking it now. He looked older, thinner, and his eyes held a haunted look, but it was him. Sully exhaled sharply. How the hell is he still alive? Ambrose crossed his arms, his jaw tightening. Better question. Why is he dropping off a dead child in a suitcase? A cold dread settled over the room. Asher Langley had once been a victim, a teenager whose family had died in a suspicious fire. But now, he was the prime suspect in something far worse. Thorne forced himself to think logically. If Asher had been alive all this time, where had he been? Why resurface now? And what did he have to do with Eleanor Finch's disappearance? None of it added up. A voice crackled through the radio, snapping Thorne from his thoughts. Agents, we pulled more footage. Langley didn't just drop off the suitcase. He stayed in the airport for nearly an hour before leaving. He was watching. A fresh wave of unease washed over the team. Where did he go? Thorne asked. There was a brief pause before the reply came. Into the parking structure. And then, he vanished. Silence settled between them. If Asher had gone through the trouble of making sure the suitcase was found, he wanted them to know. He was playing a game. And Thorne had the sinking feeling that they had only just begun to understand the rules. Thorne Calloway's grip tightened around the edge of the console as the weight of the situation sank in. Asher Langley had been inside the airport for an hour, watching. And now he was gone. Vanished into thin air, just like he had 2 years ago. The security officer rewound the footage, showing Asher's last known location, a dimly lit parking structure where he moved swiftly between the rows of vehicles before slipping into the shadows. There were no clear shots of him leaving. No license plates, no car matching his description. It was like he had planned his disappearance perfectly. Again. Sullivan, Sully. Graves let out a frustrated sigh, rubbing the back of his neck. This guy's a ghost. He shows up with a dead child in a suitcase and then just walks out of a high-security airport like it's nothing? That doesn't happen by accident. Ambrose Keaton, ever the strategist, crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. He wanted us to see him, he said, his voice quiet but firm. He knew exactly where the cameras were. He let us get a look at his face. The real question is, why? Thorne's stomach churned. He had seen criminals taunt law enforcement before, but this felt different. There was intent behind Asher's actions, a controlled madness lurking beneath the surface. He wasn't hiding. He was leading them somewhere. But to what? He turned to the security officer. Pull every camera from the parking structure. If he had help, I want to know who. The officer nodded and got to work. A sharp knock on the door made them all turn. A forensic technician stepped in, his face pale, his gloved hands holding a sealed evidence bag. Inside was the bracelet from the suitcase. "We cleaned it up," the tech said, his voice tight. "There was something else engraved on the inside." He handed the bag to Thorne. Through the plastic, he could now clearly read the words beneath Eleanor Finch's name. "Find me before they do." Silence filled the room. Sully let out a slow breath. "Jesus." Ambrose muttered something under his breath before taking the bag from Thorne's hands, studying the bracelet like it might offer more answers. "This wasn't just a message," he said finally. "This was a warning." Thorne felt a cold, creeping certainty settle in his chest. Asher Langley hadn't resurfaced just to taunt them. He was running from something. And if he had gone through all this effort to leave a trail, then whatever he was afraid of was coming next. Thorne Calloway stared at the words engraved inside the bracelet. "Find me before they do." The message burned into his mind, each letter a riddle wrapped in fear. Asher Langley wasn't just some fugitive playing games. He was desperate. Whatever he had been running from for the past 2 years had finally caught up to him. And now, he was throwing himself into the hands of law enforcement as if it was his only chance of survival. Sully, Graves let out a slow breath, his eyes flicking between the bracelet and the paused security footage. "He wants us to follow him," he muttered. "He left the body, made sure we'd recognize him, and then disappeared just long enough to keep us chasing him." He shook his head. "This guy could have stayed off the grid forever, but instead, he's practically begging us to catch him." Ambrose Keaton was still gripping the evidence bag, his expression dark. "Because whatever's after him is worse than anything we can do to him," he said. "And he knows it." Thorne ran a hand over his face, exhaustion and unease pressing down on him. Every new clue only raised more questions. Who was Asher afraid of? Why was Eleanor Finch's body tied to this? And what the hell had happened to him in the last 2 years? He turned back to the forensic technician. "Get that bracelet dusted for prints. I want to know if there's anything else on it, residue, blood, anything." The tech nodded and hurried off. A new voice crackled over Sully's radio. "Agents, we've got something else. We checked the airport's external security cameras. We found the car." Instantly, all 3 men snapped to attention. "Details?" Thorne asked, already moving toward the door. "Black SUV, tinted windows, no plates," the officer replied. "But here's the thing. Langley wasn't driving." The words sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through Thorne. "What do you mean?" The officer hesitated. "Langley got into the passenger seat. Someone else was behind the wheel." The room went completely silent. That changed everything. Up until now, they had assumed Asher had been working alone, but if he had help, or worse, if he was being controlled, then they had just stepped into something far more dangerous than a missing persons case. Thorne exhaled slowly, his instincts screaming that they were running out of time. Asher had left them breadcrumbs for a reason. If they didn't move fast, whatever had driven him into the shadows would catch up to him first. And something told Thorne that if that happened, they'd never find him again. The black SUV moved like a shadow through the airport's external surveillance footage. No plates. Tinted windows. No identifying marks. It had pulled up to the curb, sat idle for 5 long minutes, and then, like clockwork, Asher Langley had climbed into the passenger seat. The moment the door shut behind him, the SUV pulled away, slipping into traffic like it had never been there. No hesitation. No wasted movement. Whoever was driving knew exactly what they were doing. Thorne Calloway watched the grainy footage on repeat, his mind racing. "Can we track it?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. No plates, no GPS hit, no traffic cam alerts. The SUV had likely switched vehicles the moment it was out of sight. They were dealing with professionals. Sully, Graves let out a frustrated breath. So we have Langley literally walking into a moving crime scene, and we have no way to follow it? He ran a hand through his hair, shaking his head. This just keeps getting better. Ambrose Keaton, ever the strategist, was already 2 steps ahead. If Langley wanted to disappear, he wouldn't have left clues. He wants us to find him. He turned to the security technician. Pull the footage from every traffic camera in a 5-mile radius. If they switched cars, I want to see where. The tech nodded and got to work. Thorne's mind, however, was stuck on something else. Asher wasn't alone. That meant he wasn't just running. He was being taken somewhere. The forensic team entered the room, a younger technician holding a clipboard with a grim expression. "We finished processing the suitcase," he said, his voice tight. "There's something you need to see." He handed Thorne a printed report. His eyes skimmed over the document, heart pounding as he reached the final section. His blood turned to ice. Traces of chloroform. Faint, but present. Eleanor Finch hadn't just been killed. She had been sedated first. Sully read over his shoulder and let out a sharp breath. So whoever took her didn't want her dead. At least not right away. His voice was thick with anger. Which means this wasn't some random kidnapping. It was planned. Ambrose's face darkened. And if Asher Langley was involved, willingly or not, then we're looking at something a hell of a lot bigger than a runaway kid and a missing girl. Thorne clenched his jaw, his mind connecting pieces that still refused to fit together. Eleanor Finch. Asher Langley. The missing years. The black SUV. Something was tying them all together. Something dark. Something planned. And whatever it was, they were running out of time to stop it. Thorne Calloway sat in silence, gripping the forensic report as his mind churned through the implications. Chloroform. A controlled abduction. A planned disposal. Eleanor Finch's death hadn't been a crime of opportunity. It had been calculated. And now, Asher Langley was either a puppet in this game or a player. Thorne wasn't sure which possibility was worse. Sully. Graves tapped his fingers against the desk, restless energy radiating from him. "Let's say Langley's involved," he said. "That still doesn't explain why he'd go from being a missing kid to dropping bodies at an airport." He leaned forward. "And why resurface now? If he's running, it's because something changed. Something forced him out of hiding." His words hung heavy in the air. What was Asher Langley running from? Ambrose Keaton, still studying the security footage, suddenly stiffened. "Hold on." His fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up an older case file. He enlarged a still image from a missing persons report and placed it next to the airport footage of Asher. Thorne's breath caught as he saw the detail Ambrose had noticed. The bracelet. The same one Eleanor Finch had been wearing. Asher Langley had an identical one on his wrist. Thorne's pulse quickened. "That's not a coincidence," he muttered. "Someone gave him that bracelet. Someone who had access to Eleanor Finch before she was taken." A cold dread settled in his gut. If Asher had been in captivity all these years, what if Eleanor wasn't the only one? What if there were more victims? Children who never made it back? Sully stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "If he was held somewhere, we need to find out where." His voice was sharp, determined. "And if he escaped?" He hesitated, exchanging a glance with Thorne. "Then whoever took him is going to come looking. And Asher Langley might not be the only one in danger." Thorne exhaled, the weight of the case pressing against him. This wasn't just about a missing kid returning from the dead. It was about something bigger, something buried. And if they didn't figure it out fast, more bodies would start appearing. The realization settled like ice in Thorne Calloway's veins. Asher Langley wasn't just running, he was warning them. The matching bracelets weren't a coincidence. They were a link. A connection between Eleanor Finch and whatever nightmare Asher had barely escaped from. If he had been taken years ago, and Eleanor had been taken just months ago, how many others had vanished the same way? Sully Graves had already pulled up a list of missing children from the last 5 years. Dozens of unsolved cases. He filtered them, looking for one detail: bracelets. The screen filled with reports, each child's name a tragedy that had never found justice. And then, Sully's voice dropped to a whisper. Holy hell! He turned the screen so Thorne and Ambrose Keaton could see. 7 different missing children. All wearing silver bracelets. Ambrose leaned forward, his mind working at lightning speed. This isn't just some serial abduction case, he murmured. This is systematic. Coordinated. These kids weren't just taken, they were being kept somewhere. He pointed at Asher's image on the airport footage. And Langley? He got out. Somehow he escaped. His voice hardened. But he didn't come back alone. Thorne felt his stomach tighten. If Asher had spent years trapped somewhere with these other children, had he been the only survivor? Or were there others still out there? More importantly, who had taken them? This wasn't some random kidnapper. This was organized, funded, hidden. Eleanor Finch's body had been found, but what about the others? Had Asher left that suitcase behind to tell them she was the first to die? Or just the first they had found? Sully clenched his jaw, his anger barely contained. We need to find him. Now. His words were firm, unwavering. Before they do. But Thorne wasn't so sure they were the hunters in this situation. A nagging thought gnawed at the back of his mind. What if Asher wasn't just leading them to the truth? What if he was leading something back to them? Thorne Calloway barely had time to process the horrifying pattern before his radio crackled with urgency. Agents, Langley just turned himself in. The words sent a jolt through him. His eyes snapped to Sully Graves, and Ambrose Keaton, who looked equally stunned. Asher had spent years hiding, running, and now, just hours after leaving them the body of Eleanor Finch, he was surrendering? Something wasn't right. They rushed to the precinct, where Asher Langley sat in an interrogation room, hands cuffed to the table. He was thinner than Thorne remembered, his skin pale, dark circles under his haunted eyes. His fingers fidgeted with the silver bracelet still on his wrist. The same one Eleanor had worn. The moment Thorne stepped inside, Asher looked up, his voice hoarse but deliberate. You found her. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. Thorne took a seat across from him. You left her for us to find, he said evenly. Why? Asher exhaled, his gaze flickering to the mirrored glass behind them, as if someone else might be watching. Because they already know you're looking, he murmured. And now they'll come for me. His fingers tightened around the bracelet. I wasn't the only one, Calloway. There are more. Still alive. Still waiting. A chill ran through Thorne. Sully leaned forward. Who took you, Asher? The young man hesitated. Then he slid up his sleeve, revealing a deep, jagged brand burned into his forearm, a symbol. Not random. Intentional. Thorne's stomach turned. He recognized it from crime scene photos. A mark tied to an underground network that law enforcement had tried and failed to dismantle for years. Human trafficking. Experimentation. People who disappeared and never came back. Ambrose clenched his jaw. Where are they? He demanded. Asher's hands trembled. I don't know, he admitted. They blindfolded us. Kept us underground. He swallowed hard. But I know one thing. Eleanor wasn't supposed to die. She was the warning. His voice dropped. And if I found my way back, they'll be coming to clean up their mess. Thorne's blood ran cold. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. Thorne Calloway sat across from Asher Langley, watching the young man's every move. He looked like someone who had forgotten how to exist in the real world. His face was drawn, his hollow eyes darting from one corner of the room to the next, as if expecting something to reach out from the shadows. But the worst part wasn't his fear, it was the acceptance in his expression. The kind of look someone had when they had already lived through their worst nightmare. And survived. Sully, Graves exhaled sharply, running a hand down his face before finally speaking. "All right, Langley, enough with the theatrics," he said. "You knew we'd find the girl. You knew we'd find you. Now tell us why." His voice was firm, but beneath it was something else, an unease Sully rarely let show. Ambrose Keaton, always the quiet strategist, leaned against the far wall, arms crossed, his cold stare fixed on Asher like a sniper calculating his next shot. The tension in the room was thick, a slow suffocation neither of them could escape. Asher let out a slow, ragged breath and finally met Thorne's gaze. "You think I left Eleanor there to send a message?" His voice was rough, strained, as if speaking was painful. A bitter, humorless chuckle escaped his lips. "You still think this is just starting?" He shook his head. "This has been going on for years. You're just late to the party." He lifted his wrist, twisting the silver bracelet around like a nervous tick. "And I'm the only one who made it out." The weight of those words sent a cold ripple through Thorne's chest. He had spent years chasing ghosts, missing kids who never came home, cases that went cold before they even had a chance to warm up. If Asher was telling the truth, this wasn't some isolated crime. It was a system, a cycle, a machine that had been running beneath their noses for longer than they could imagine. His fingers twitched as the next question formed in his mind, but before he could ask, Asher exhaled shakily and rolled up his sleeve. The scars hit like a punch to the gut. Not one, but 3 brands burned deep into his forearm, jagged symbols overlapping each other, forming a grotesque history of pain. Thorne had seen torture marks before. He had seen gang initiations, ritualistic carvings. But this was different. The marks weren't just for suffering. They meant something. Ambrose took a slow step forward, his eyes narrowing as he examined the symbols. "These aren't random," he murmured. "They're levels." His voice was carefully controlled, but there was a sharp edge beneath it. He looked up at Asher. "A ranking system." A pause. Then, his voice dropped lower. "The ones who don't pass." Asher clenched his jaw. "They disappear." His fingers tightened into fists, his knuckles white. "The ones who pass move to the next stage." He didn't elaborate, and Thorne wasn't sure he wanted him to. Sully's patience snapped. He slammed his hand against the table, the sound ricocheting off the walls like a gunshot. "Eleanor Finch didn't pass." His voice was tight with barely contained anger. He wasn't asking. He already knew the answer. Asher didn't flinch. He just let out a slow breath, his shoulders sagging. His eyes, empty, exhausted, lifted to meet Thorne's again. "She never even had a chance." Thorne Calloway sat motionless, Asher Langley's words echoing in his head. "She never even had a chance." The room felt smaller, the air thick with something unspoken, something rotten. He had chased criminals his entire career, but this wasn't crime. It was something else. A system. A process. And if Asher was telling the truth, Eleanor Finch wasn't supposed to die. Which meant someone would be cleaning up the mess she left behind. Sully, Graves was the first to break the silence, his voice cold and sharp. "You keep saying this is bigger than we think." His fingers drummed against the table, controlled, calculated. "So tell us, who's running the show? Who the hell is taking these kids?" Ambrose Keaton, still studying Asher like a puzzle missing half its pieces, leaned in slightly. "And why did they let you go?" The unspoken words lingered in the air. "Or did you escape?" Asher let out a slow, shaky breath and lowered his gaze. "They don't have names," he murmured. "Not real ones. The people who take us, they wear masks. Not the kind you pull off. The kind that are part of them. Like they were never people to begin with." He swallowed, his fingers tracing the scarred marks on his arm. "They don't talk to us. Not unless they're choosing who moves forward." His voice wavered slightly. "You don't want them to talk to you." Thorne exchanged a look with Ambrose. He had heard this before. Not in a police report, not in a case file, but from a witness years ago. A woman who had escaped from something she couldn't describe, who swore the people who had taken her weren't human. He had dismissed it as trauma, a mind trying to rationalize horror. But now, hearing it again, from Asher Langley, a boy who had vanished off the face of the earth for 2 years, the feeling in his gut was different. Sully stood abruptly, pacing the length of the room. "You're telling me some faceless organization is taking kids, branding them like cattle, and putting them through, what? Some kind of test?" He scoffed. "And what the hell happens to the ones who pass?" He turned back to Asher, his eyes dark with something unreadable. "Because clearly, you passed." Asher didn't answer right away. He just stared at his hands, the fingers that wouldn't stop trembling. When he finally spoke, his voice was almost too quiet to hear. "I don't know." He swallowed. "Because the ones who passed, I never saw them again." This story is building toward its most terrifying revelations. Asher survived something designed to erase people completely. The ones who failed disappeared. But the ones who passed? No one knows where they went. The room felt colder, as if something unseen had crept into the space between them. "I never saw them again." Asher Langley's words refused to leave Thorne Calloway's mind. He had been in this job long enough to recognize when someone was holding back, but this wasn't hesitation. This was trauma. This was someone who had seen something so horrifying that even putting it into words felt dangerous. Sully. Graves leaned against the wall, arms crossed tightly over his chest. His usual sarcasm had disappeared, replaced by something quieter. "Darker." "All right, Langley," he muttered. "You're saying there were others. Kids like you. And some of them made it to the next stage, whatever the hell that means. But what happened to them?" His jaw tightened. "Where did they go?" Asher hesitated, fingers twitching against his sleeve. He wasn't looking at them anymore. His gaze was far away, lost in memories he clearly didn't want to revisit. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't know where they went," he admitted. "But I know one thing. No one ever came back." He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "One kid, Micah, he was older than me. Stronger. Smarter. He always said if he made it through, he'd come back for the rest of us." A bitter chuckle escaped his lips. "But he didn't." Thorne studied him carefully. "How do you know he passed?" he asked. Asher flinched slightly before rolling up his sleeve. The brands were still there, 3 jagged symbols, each burned deep into his skin. "Because he got the final mark," he murmured. "The third one." His fingers brushed over the raised scar tissue. "When you got that, they took you." He swallowed. "And no one ever saw you again." A heavy silence followed. Ambrose Keaton, who had been carefully analyzing Asher this whole time, finally spoke. His voice was steady, but his words carried weight. "And the ones who failed?" He leaned in slightly, his expression unreadable. "What happened to them?" Asher's hands clenched into fists. His breathing grew unsteady, his shoulders stiff as if his body was trying to physically reject the memory. For a long moment, it seemed like he wouldn't answer. But then, finally, in a voice so quiet it was almost lost in the hum of the overhead lights, he whispered, "I don't know." He swallowed hard, eyes unfocused. "But I heard them scream." The mystery deepens. The missing children weren't just taken, they were tested. The ones who passed vanished without a trace, and the ones who failed, no one knows what happened to them. Asher Langley's last words lingered in the air like a slow-acting poison. "But I heard them scream." The weight of that admission pressed down on the room, suffocating, twisting in Thorne Calloway's chest like a knife. He had seen people lie, had seen them twist stories to protect themselves, but there was no deception in Asher's voice. No exaggeration. Just the raw, undeniable truth of someone who had been there, who had witnessed something beyond comprehension. And survived. Sullivan Sully Graves was pacing now, his usual sarcastic exterior stripped away, replaced by something else, a deep, unsettled frustration. "So let me get this straight," he said, running a hand through his hair, his movements tense. "These bastards take kids. They throw them into some kind of sick experiment. And if they don't pass, if they don't do whatever the hell they were supposed to, they're just gone." His voice grew sharper, filled with something just short of rage. Because for once, Sully wasn't just angry. He was afraid. Asher sat motionless, staring at the table, his fingers tracing invisible patterns on the cold metal. He wasn't just remembering. He was reliving it. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost fragile. "They didn't just take us away. They made us fail." He inhaled sharply, his hands twitching. "They watched. Always watching. Never speaking. Just waiting for us to make the wrong move." His Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. "And if you got it wrong, if you didn't do what they wanted, you disappeared." Ambrose Keaton remained eerily still, his fingers interlaced in front of him. He had seen war zones, had interrogated hardened killers, but this was something different. "Define wrong," he said finally, his voice measured. "Was it physical? Psychological? Were they testing strength? Intelligence?" His eyes narrowed. "Or obedience?" Thorne barely breathed as he watched Asher's reaction. A flicker of something passed across his face. Not anger, not fear, but something closer to shame. His hands curled into fists in his lap, his shoulders tightening like he was bracing for a hit. "They wanted us to be something we weren't," he whispered. "Something less." He exhaled sharply. The ones who fought back were the first to go. The ones who asked too many questions? Gone. The ones who cried too much? He hesitated. They didn't last long. Thorne clenched his jaw, his stomach twisting with nausea. This wasn't just some trafficking ring. This was something far worse. A system. A method. A controlled experiment where children were nothing more than raw material, to be reshaped, broken, or discarded. The worst part? It was still happening. The case is spiraling into something unimaginable. The missing children weren't just victims, they were experiments. The ones who failed were erased. The ones who passed? No one knows where they went. But now, Thorne and his team aren't just chasing a criminal. They're chasing something much bigger. The weight of Asher Langley's words settled like a storm cloud over the room. The ones who fought back were the first to go. The ones who cried too much didn't last long. Every syllable carried the weight of something monstrous, something that had operated in the shadows for years, maybe even decades, without anyone stopping it. Thorne Calloway felt a sickening realization creep up his spine. This wasn't a one-time event. This was a system. A carefully controlled process that had taken God knows how many children before Asher Langley finally managed to crawl out of its grasp. Sullivan, Sully, Graves stopped pacing and turned to Asher, his voice quieter than before but no less intense. "You keep saying they," he murmured. "But you're not talking about just one person, are you?" His fingers tapped rhythmically against the table, the only sound in the suffocating silence. "You're talking about an organization, a network." His jaw tightened. "Something that doesn't just take kids, but watches them, studies them, decides who's worth keeping." Asher's entire body stiffened. His breathing grew shallower, his fingers digging into the fabric of his sleeves. He didn't nod. He didn't need to. His silence was confirmation enough. He squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head slightly, as if even speaking about it would make it real again. "They were always there," he finally said, voice barely above a whisper. "Watching, studying, judging." His breathing hitched. "And when you were chosen, they made you disappear. Not just from the others. From everything." Thorne's stomach churned. "How many?" he asked, keeping his voice level. "How many kids did they take?" Asher let out a breath that sounded dangerously close to a sob. "I stopped counting at 30. His eyes flickered to the one-way mirror, as if expecting someone to be on the other side. "Watching, listening. But I know it was more." His voice dropped lower. "And I know it's still happening." Ambrose Keaton, who had remained unervingly quiet, finally spoke. "You escaped," he said flatly. "But how?" There was no disbelief in his tone, just calculation, a man fitting the final pieces into a puzzle he didn't like. "They wouldn't just let someone like you walk away." Asher's lips parted slightly, but no words came out. He looked down at his hands, as if suddenly unsure if they were even real. His fingers trembled. And for the first time, Thorne saw something new in his expression. Guilt. "I wasn't supposed to," Asher admitted, voice raw. "I wasn't the one meant to get out." The room fell deathly silent. And in that moment, Thorne realized something horrifying. Asher hadn't just escaped. Someone else had taken his place. The truth is unraveling. The kidnappings weren't random, they were selections. The ones who were taken were being tested, observed, and categorized. And Asher? He wasn't supposed to be here. Which means someone else is still trapped. The room had gone deathly quiet, the kind of silence that suffocated, thick and oppressive. "I wasn't supposed to get out." Asher Langley's words had landed like a bomb, the implications sinking into Thorne Calloway's gut like a heavy stone. Asher had escaped, but someone else had taken his place. Sully. Graves let out a slow breath, his fingers drumming on the table, his frustration barely contained. "What do you mean you weren't supposed to get out?" he asked, his voice low and sharp. "Who was?" His eyes locked onto Asher, waiting, demanding an answer. For a long moment, Asher didn't speak. He just stared at his hands, at the silver bracelet circling his wrist, turning it over and over between his fingers. It was as if he was somewhere else entirely. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse, strained. "Micah," he whispered. "Micah was supposed to go. Not me." His throat bobbed as he swallowed. "We made a plan. We were supposed to run together. But when the time came, when we finally had our chance, he pushed me forward. He stayed behind." Thorne clenched his jaw. He had dealt with cases of missing children before. Had seen parents fall apart at press conferences, had watched search efforts go from hopeful to desperate to resigned. But this was different. This wasn't a case of a kid being snatched and never seen again. This was calculated, structured. Someone had created a process, a system. And Micah? Micah had been a part of it. Ambrose Keaton, still eerily calm, leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. "Why?" he asked, his voice devoid of emotion. If you both had a way out, why would he stay? Why would he let you go and not himself? Asher exhaled sharply. His hands trembled as he clenched them into fists. Because, he whispered, Micah had the final mark. His voice cracked and his breath hitched. He had already passed. His fingers curled tighter around the bracelet, his knuckles turning white. And once you pass, they don't let you go. The room went cold. Thorne felt his stomach sink. Micah hadn't just been left behind. He had been taken. He had passed the final test, whatever the hell that meant, and now he belonged to them. And if they didn't move fast, they would never see him again. The stakes just got even higher. Micah wasn't just left behind. He was chosen. He had reached the final stage, and now the people running this system weren't going to let him go. But why? What was waiting for him beyond that last door? The air in the interrogation room felt thick, heavy with something unspoken. Micah had passed. That word, passed, felt all wrong, as if they were discussing an exam, a test, something routine. But there was nothing normal about what Micah had gone through. He had reached the final stage, whatever that meant, and instead of escaping, he had given up his chance at freedom to push Asher forward. That wasn't just survival. That was sacrifice. Thorne Calloway clenched his fists under the table, fighting back the sick feeling creeping up his spine. What did it mean to pass? Where was Micah now? What had they done to him? Thorne had dealt with every kind of criminal in his career. Traffickers, serial offenders, people who preyed on the weak. But this wasn't just crime. This was something structured, something controlled, something designed to break and rebuild people. Sully, Graves exhaled sharply, his temper fraying at the edges. "All right," he said, voice taut with restraint. "Micah passed. They didn't let him go. But you know where he went, don't you?" His sharp blue eyes locked onto Asher. "Don't tell me you don't." Asher didn't speak. He stared down at the table, shoulders stiff, fingers twitching. He knew. Thorne could see it written all over him. He wasn't trying to lie. He was trying to decide if he could even say it out loud. Ambrose Keaton, ever the strategist, leaned forward slightly, his gaze unwavering. "You saw, didn't you?" His voice was quieter, but there was an edge to it, a cold calculation. "Maybe not everything, but enough." Asher's breath hitched. His entire body tensed as if he were about to break. His hand curled tighter around his wrist, his nails digging into the skin. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, finally, he gave the smallest nod. Silence fell over the room. Thorne's pulse pounded in his ears. Asher Langley knew exactly what had happened to Micah. And whatever it was, it had been enough to make him run for his life. The truth is closing in. Asher has seen what happens to the ones who pass. But what did he see? And is Micah still alive? The weight of Asher Langley's nod sent a ripple of unease through the room. He had seen what happened to the ones who passed. He had witnessed something so disturbing that he had chosen to run, to abandon Micah, to disappear rather than face whatever fate awaited those who stayed. Thorne Calloway felt his pulse hammering against his skull. The pieces were all there, scattered like broken glass, but none of them fit together. What did they do to the ones who passed? Why was Micah considered chosen? And who the hell was behind all of this? Sully, Graves let out a slow breath, his frustration barely contained. His patience was running thin. "You're holding back," he said, his voice dangerously low. He leaned in, his hands pressed flat against the table. "You saw what happened. I need you to say it. Out loud." Asher flinched, his fingers curling tighter around his wrist, as if he could physically stop himself from speaking. He didn't want to say it. But the fear in his eyes told Thorne one thing. If they didn't get to Micah soon, they wouldn't get to him at all. Ambrose Keaton, calm but relentless, fixed his sharp gaze on Asher. "You survived," he said, his voice quieter but no less intense. "But not because they let you go. Someone else made that choice for you. Micah did." He tilted his head slightly. "The question is, why? What did he know that you didn't?" The moment those words left Ambrose's mouth, Asher's breath hitched. His entire body tensed. And then, finally, he broke. "They changed them." His voice was barely above a whisper. His hands trembled as he pressed them against his temples, squeezing his eyes shut as if trying to block out the memories. The ones who passed, they weren't the same when they came back. They weren't them anymore. Thorne felt a chill crawl up his spine. "What do you mean, changed?" Asher's breathing was ragged, uneven. He looked up, his haunted eyes locking onto Thorne's. "They made them into something else." The truth is more terrifying than they imagined. The ones who passed didn't just disappear, they were changed. But into what? And is Micah still himself, or has he become something else entirely? The room had never felt heavier. Asher Langley was drowning in his memories, his body in the interrogation room, but his mind trapped somewhere else, somewhere dark. Thorne Calloway could see it in his eyes, in the way his hands trembled against his arms, gripping so tightly his nails dug into his own skin. This wasn't just trauma. It was fear. A deep, instinctual terror that no amount of time had managed to erase. For a long moment, no one spoke. Sully and Ambrose were waiting, but Thorne knew they all felt it. The sense that whatever Asher was about to say would be worse than anything they had imagined. Worse than bodies in suitcases, than brands burned into flesh, than children disappearing into the unknown. "They weren't the same," Asher finally whispered, his voice barely carrying across the room. His breathing was ragged, his shoulders tense. "The ones who passed, they weren't the same when they came back." Sully, Graves exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Different how?" His voice had lost its usual sharpness. It was quieter now, as if he wasn't sure he wanted the answer. "Brainwashed? Drugged? You think they did something to their heads?" Asher flinched at the question. "No," he swallowed hard, his gaze flickering toward the one-way mirror, his fingers still clenching at the silver bracelet on his wrist. "It wasn't just their minds. It was everything. Their bodies. Their faces. Their eyes." Ambrose Keaton's expression barely changed, but Thorne saw it, a flicker of understanding. Of realization. But Ambrose didn't speak yet. He was waiting for Asher to say it out loud. Asher squeezed his eyes shut. His voice was raw when he spoke again. "They weren't human anymore." The words sent a chill through Thorne's spine. Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Sully let out a humorless laugh, a desperate attempt to ground himself. "Come on, kid. What are you saying? That they, what? Grew fangs? Turned into monsters?" He shook his head, but the way his fingers twitched against his knee told a different story. He didn't believe Asher. But he also didn't know if he could afford not to. Asher slowly lifted his gaze. His eyes were red-rimmed, unfocused, lost. "Not all monsters have fangs," he whispered. "Some just stop being what they were." He exhaled, a shuddering breath. "Some become something else." Thorne clenched his jaw, forcing himself to push forward. "Micah," he said, his voice steady. "You said he was supposed to escape." Asher flinched. Ambrose leaned in slightly. "But he didn't. He stayed behind. And he already had the final mark." His voice was measured, dissecting every word. "So tell me, Asher, did you ever see him again?" The second those words left Ambrose's mouth, Asher's entire body locked up. His breathing became shallow. His fingers curled tighter around his own wrists, like he was bracing himself for something that wasn't there. And that's when Thorne knew. Micah hadn't just stayed behind. He had come back. But whatever had returned wearing his face, it wasn't Micah anymore. Asher Langley sat frozen, his breath coming in shallow bursts, his fingers gripping his own arms so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He had seen Micah again. That much was clear. But it hadn't been Micah. Not anymore. Thorne Calloway leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "Tell me what you saw." Asher swallowed hard. His throat bobbed as he tried to form the words, but something inside him resisted, like his own mind was rejecting the memory. "It wasn't him," he finally whispered. "Not really." Sully, Graves exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand down his face. "Enough with the riddles, kid," he snapped, his voice laced with frustration, but also something else. Nervousness. Unease. "Did you see him or not?" Asher's gaze snapped to Sully, and for the first time since this conversation began, his expression shifted. Anger, fear, grief, a deep, festering regret. "I saw him," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But it wasn't him anymore." Silence. Ambrose Keaton was the first to break it. "Describe what you saw." His voice was cold, clinical, but Thorne knew him well enough to recognize when even Ambrose was disturbed. Asher let out a shaky breath. Micah was different. His eyes, they were empty. Not blank, not scared, empty. Like he wasn't looking at me, even when he was. Like he didn't even recognize me. His fingers trembled as he continued. His voice was wrong. Flat. Like he was repeating something someone else told him to say. He swallowed. And his skin, it was too smooth. Too perfect. Like it wasn't even real. Thorne felt something cold settle in his gut. Micah had been turned into something else. Sully shook his head. "You're telling me these sick bastards brainwashed him? That's what this is? Some kind of conditioning program?" He sounded like he wanted to believe it. Like he needed to believe that this could still be explained in a way that made sense. But Asher's next words shattered that illusion. "I don't think it was Micah anymore," he said. "I think they made a new one." The air in the room felt like it had been sucked out. Ambrose was the first to speak. "You're saying they replaced him?" Asher nodded. His eyes flickered with something deeper than fear. Certainty. Thorne's mind raced. How? How could someone be replaced so perfectly that it mimicked the original? Was this extreme psychological conditioning? Genetic manipulation? Something worse? Asher exhaled. And the worst part? His voice cracked slightly. "The last thing he said to me before I ran?" Sully hesitated. "What did he say?" Asher lifted his gaze, his haunted eyes meeting Thorne's. And when he spoke, his voice was not his own. "You should have stayed. They're going to come for you next." The end, or just the beginning? The final horror is revealed. The missing children weren't just tested. They were replaced. But by what? And if Micah was allowed to leave, was he the only one? Or were there more?